UFOs are everywhere. That's right, UFOs, unidentified file objects, are hiding in files in your cloud apps and storage. UFOs can contain malware that exfiltrates data or deploys ransomware. 70% of UFOs in files can't be detected or prevented by traditional scanning solutions like antivirus and sandboxing. That's where Vatiro comes in. Vatiro prevents UFOs before they hitch a ride in on files in the cloud, without detection and without slowing down business. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Vatiro. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Passbolt is a free and open source password manager that allows your team to store, organize, and share passwords securely. Passbolt is privacy first and highly versatile. It can be installed on-prem behind your firewall, used in a secure cloud, or deployed as a cloud-native application. You can check out the source code on GitHub, extend it with the REST API, integrate it with the CLI or SDKs, and even contribute. Get started with Passbolt for free now. Check it out at securityweekly.com/Passbolt. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Ken White about queryable encryption and building systems that are developer-friendly, like having useful documentation and actually asking them for feedback. It's quite elementary. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand, and it's just about time for the news. But first, Security Weekly listeners, we need to hear your voices. Leave us your feedback on Apple Podcasts and submit a screenshot to our giveaway form for a chance to win a $100 gift card from Hacker Warehouse. This giveaway will be open until the end of 2022. Hopefully 2022 ends. We appreciate your honest feedback so we can continue to make great content for all of you. Enter at securityweekly.com/giveaway. Now, Akira, John, it's been 2 weeks. We had last week off because of the holiday here in the US, and there's just a little bit of a backlog, I suppose, of news that's crept up. There's a couple fun things that I have a theme of research, and we'll try and see how much of that research comes through all of the articles that we find. I'll kick things off just by looking at a confused deputy in AWS AppSync. So talking about databases or data stores with MongoDB and Ken in just the previous segment, which was really fun. And there's a lot more depth. Would have loved to go into the crypto side, but didn't want to lose everyone on math, possibly including me. You're welcome. So here is AWS AppSync, which is basically a way to look into some GraphQL. And we've talked about GraphQL and thought about, what could go wrong here with GraphQL? And Datadog, which is kind of neat. It's interesting to see a company that I don't normally associate with security talking about security research and basically showing that confused deputy. Think of CSRF or SSRF and saying, hey, what if I have an ARN? I need some identifier in some way. So there's a little bit of hand waving there. But if I have an ARN from some other tenant, I can trick AppSync into go and looking for what data that might exist from it. And so it's basically deputizing AppSync to go work on the attacker's behalf to say, hey, is there a misconfiguration or is there a weakness here in the IAM roles that I can go peer across tenants? So it's a wonderful type of research. And it's also a great write-up because it walks through one of the things we like to highlight, that attacker mentality. Quote, can we somehow trick the AppSync service to assume a role and account we don't control and access its resources? And one of the other points they say is, they point out before I turn it over to the floor, detecting this attack can be challenging because the associated CloudTrail logs indicate that it's coming from the AppSync service itself. And that, once again, is really interesting because Ken did at one point talk about some of the basics of just, do you know what's running on your network? Do you have visibility, observability, monitoring? And here's a case with this confused deputy attack, or with AppSync attack. CloudTrail does give you some monitoring, but it's not detailed enough. So I thought that was kind of cool. So John, I think you and I have talked about GraphQL. I wasn't sure if there's anything that was like not quite an "I told you so," perhaps, but an "Oh, interesting. I didn't see this coming."
Well, the first one for me was I just got caught off guard because it AppSync versus app config. I use app config. I don't use AppSync. And I'm like, oh my god, there's a vulnerability in something I'm using. But I think probably, as you were saying, probably the most impressive part about this to me is Datadog or really anybody tracking this down. And I think the takeaway from an AppSec point of view there is for people who, no one's going to find that vulnerability, that type of thing, or like people sort of lazily coding. I think we'll probably talk. We've already mentioned once this episode threat modeling. We're probably going to mention it again. And this is one of those type of things of like, as soon as you those words come out of your mouth, and they come out of mine sometimes, of like no one's ever going to find that vulnerability. You need to stop and thinking, okay, is that really the case, or who could actually? Maybe a threat model is Datadog going to be looking at my application?
No, indeed. Yeah, and I wonder too, Akira, this is, I don't think we've thrown GraphQL in front of you before, but, there's a cloud aspect here, IAM, authentication, authorization. I'm curious, did we start triggering some threat modeling off of your head, out of your head as we were talking about this as well?
Well, I have to be honest, I haven't used GraphQL before, so I'm not super versed in this, but it is interesting to think that you could start to gain some insight into the IAM model. And I actually wanted to ask you, Mike, if you could go into that a little tiny bit more, as I'm not that familiar with it.
Well, neither are many people who use AWS, because this is exceedingly complicated, because in IAM pretty much, and here is where I'm trying to be careful and not misspeak too much, but...
And watch John's big grin while Mike tries to...
Yes, exactly. On the hot seat. Essentially, AWS is one of those areas of, IAM is one of those areas within AWS that is very complex. And pretty much any identity can have a role that says... Are you authorized to talk to this service or this other service? And what is this interaction of authorizations within these identities of a human or a service or an S3 bucket, et cetera, and so on and so on. So it gets very complex. And I think what the takeaway here is to try and still answer the question, but remain at a high level, is that the idea is that AppSync had a privileged position because of a misconfiguration, misimplementation, where it was not fully constrained within a tenant, so within your full AWS account, through underneath which all the tree of the rest of your IAM roles will descend from. And that's what was very interesting and made this a cross-tenant, a very cloud-specific, AWS-specific type of danger that is not so much we're exposing our own data, but our own data may be accessible from nefarious third parties, who other tenants using AWS, which in a way also kind of ties into the discussion we just had with Ken about threat models and how we're protecting our data. So that was one of the other reasons I wanted to bring this in. And if you notice, I answered the question the way I wanted to answer it, rather than perhaps the way you meant.
So I think the question's actually really great. And so from the point of view of how do we need to spend, like a segment talking about IAM, or, listeners, I know we do this all the time, but really, ping us on Discord or something. Is this something that you're curious about? I have a love-hate relationship with IAM and ARNs and all things authentication based at Amazon. There's multiple levels of complexity on a lot of these type of things, depending on what you need to get done. But what's really interesting about this is just think about it from an engineering point of view. You're, let's just say one of the largest cloud providers out there. How do you design basically a rule-based authentication system? Authorization system. I know it's not purely rule-based, but how do you design an authorization system on a massive scale that's going to be used at, what is it, a $30 billion quarterly run rate, or was it annual? I forget. But either way, like, how do you design like something on that scale to work like that? So both the engineering behind it as well as what it actually does are either interesting or torturous, depending on who you are. But I think either way, it was a great question, Edgar.
Yeah, and of course the question or the answer changes completely when we get into GCP, which has a slightly different approach. So what we'll have to do, listeners, in 2023, let us know what kind of other questions you have, because we may have to build up an answers for Akira segment in 2023, because that was a wonderful question to get us talking.
And also, we're probably not going to cover the one at Azure because, if you work at either Wiz or Orca, you don't need authentication to get in.
Right.
Sorry, I had to go there.
I was just gonna leave a polite pause there and let John speak for everyone. So I'm going to run through a couple other. We have a lot of news, so I want to switch to something that's very specific on the surface, but I think can be broadened. And this is zero-initializing objects of automatic storage duration in C++, which hopefully neither Akira nor John has fallen asleep because I'm talking about C++, which in my heart of hearts was the most time I ever spent on a particular language. But this is interesting for small and big reasons. On the C++ side, it is something that it's a proposal that, in the write-up says, with data to back it up, that it could potentially extinguish around 10% of exploits that they've seen in the wild, which seems like a great trade-off, because we can say just by default in the standard, we want to zero-initialize large arrays, large buffers, large objects. Now, there comes with a performance impact, which it addresses. That was also a thing that we were just talking with Ken about. There is engineering behind all of these security approaches. What is the performance impact, which now in this day and age seems to be negligible because of the improvements that we have in compilers. And one other thing that I thought was great was it's already an opt-in flag, but on LLVM, for example, and GCC. But who cares about opt-in? What happened to the secure defaults? So some of this is more to broaden this a bit is the idea of what if we had secure defaults in compiler chains, in our systems, in our services, and rather than talking about hardening guides, we talked about the unhardening guides or the de-securitizing guides, and that's what people had to go in and make things weaker. But so that was the small C++ oriented, but I think the broader lesson that I pulled out of there. So I don't know, Akira or John, did I lose you on my fun with C++ here?
No, I actually was curious what that would look like if we had like these pre-hardened. What was the word you used? Sorry, Mike. I am still a little stuck on the C++ thing. But like, what would this look like? Well,
and so the non-joking answer is that it should look like a bunch of zeros that makes that makes some types of heap overriding, some types of memory exploitation issues harder to exploit because memory is now zero initialized. So you don't have garbage or heap spraying that could potentially populate these areas where these objects appear in memory. And it seems like an easy win if you can, if this is something flip on compilers or it's just by the standard. One of the things I'd be curious about is if you did flip this on, how many bugs would start to show up in your code, meaning the code was brittle or this is just something that identifies areas of code that you didn't realize was relying on undefined behaviors or assumptions. But I don't want to beat the dead horse too much on this one. So John, I'll throw over to you if there's a final comment you want there, or maybe you bring us on to the next article we should talk about.
How about all the above? So what was interesting to me about this one was, I guess I knew there was the flag there for it. It's a little surprising that in 2022 we're just getting around to talking about making that default. And unlike you, I was abused by Bjorn and Storstrip as a college student, and I don't think I've used it since. But what really caught my eye to sort of bring it down, literally, is there's a code example in the beginning of this RFP, basically. And it's got comments. So for the listeners who aren't going to go to this post, they've got like, a bunch. It's a code block of a simple main with a loop and some structs and unions and stuff. And beside each variable definition, static char, global, thread local, int, thread safe, blah blah, car buffer 128. That then have in a comment at the end of that line whether that is zero initialized or not. And I think that's going to be the biggest confusion for developers, right? It's like some of these things were actually already initiated and some were not. And like, okay, well, which one? I would imagine, Mike, I haven't seen the stat, but I imagine the zero overhead, the overhead, compute overhead for zero initializing these, that's going to be like, I mean, I guess if it's a large struct, it might be a few cycles, but even that should be a mem map of zeros, right? I mean, it shouldn't be that much of an overhead.
Yeah, it shouldn't be. And one of the things they say, they have an the part of the proposal says you can opt out, and which I think is much more helpful because then you can say you're going to opt out of this zero initialization, and now you have a code smell to go search for. You can turn your semgrabs, your ASTs searches to say, where do we have our to-dos comments, our fix me comments, and our opt out comments, because those might be those areas that are a bit more brittle. But yes, your integers and some of your basic types are already zero initialized. And I just like this in the sense of be consistent. And hopefully be consistent can also be more secure. But John, you said you said that, oh, go ahead.
Well, oh no, go ahead. You had a.
No, I was going to say, you said that you wanted to claim the stage and take us on to another article. I have a guess which is going to be. Let's see if I'm right.
Oh, the pressure. Anybody want to take bets? No, I'm going to pick on Akira. She had an article here from Sysdig talking about Docker Hub malicious images. Was that you thought I was going to go?
Nope, keep on going.
So, Akira, walk us through what's going on here. And
Yes.
I'm going to play a little bit of old man container guy, but please go ahead.
Oh, I'm so excited. Okay, cool. So Sysdig found that over 1,600 publicly available Docker Hub images actually are hiding malicious behavior. And that includes cryptocurrency miners, embedded secrets that can be used as backdoors, DNS hijackers, and website redirectors. So what I would say is the largest category was crypto miners, which was in 608 container images. Second largest was embedded secrets, which was measuring 281 cases. And what I found that was really interesting to me is that there is actually a way that you can get Docker verified to make sure that your images are actually secure. And then there's a separate entity that also does kind of like a Docker verification that I discovered. However, people are not necessarily always using the images that have been Docker verified. So this kind of reminded me a little bit of SCA, software composition analysis, where you can essentially scan your open source libraries that you're using in like a software development project. And I hadn't thought, oh wow, like you should also do similar due diligence for your Docker containers. One other thing that I found that was a little bit, not scary, but interesting, is that this stuff is really hard to catch. So the malicious actors aren't necessarily doing this a lot. So it's like, even if you catch one or two things, it's sort of like swatting at bugs in a storm, right? And then the last thing that I know when I was first learning software development, and it's kind of been repeated over and over and over again, which is surprising to me that this keeps happening, is do not put sensitive data in your Docker files or in your code. So don't put API keys, don't put private keys, don't put public keys. And I'm really surprised that that happens a lot, but also, I mean, stuff happens, I guess, but I don't know. That seems like to be one of the basic ways to guard against these kinds of attacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, think. Excuse the old jaded guys already coming out. What was the? I saw the Docker verified publisher. What was the second one you mentioned? The verified light. I'm
actually looking through my notes, and I don't think I wrote it down, which was my bad. But let me see if I can do a quick Google search.
So while you're digging through that, yeah, it's good to continuously harp on this. Okay, that sounded wrong. It's good to have this in something like a reporting like Sysdig's doing here. And from the point of view of, yeah, it's good for us to be on our radar. But the first time it sort of popped into my mind when I saw you had this in here was like, oh boy, another vendor that's spidering through Docker Hub and going to tell us about all the malware that's in there. Yeah, we've heard this before. There's a few different aspects. I mean, it's good to know. It's good for, I mean, unfortunately, the statement you said there of, don't put secrets into your containers. That's like ground zero. No one should be doing that. You'd think that, but man, so many people are doing this. Mm-hmm. And it's funny. I was talking with an organization last week, and if you start thinking about the complexity of containers or really modern day cloud cloud native. I mean, this was a non-technical person I was talking to, and I started walking through all the pieces you have to do to have this life cycle in place, and then put the security pieces in place on top of it. And I could hear in the tone of her voice, just complete confusion of what I was talking about as I was walking through slowly. And if a premier application security podcast host can't explain this to somebody easily, then good luck for the average person. So on top of that, the second part, and then we can keep going, is the verification part. So yeah, it's good to be verified by Docker. That's more for the software publishers like the Mongos or the MySQLs, or someone who's actually publishing publishing a container image, versus someone who is just saying, hey, we're building our images, we're putting them up onto Docker for distribution internally, or just as a public, maybe an open source thing. But I'm guessing was Sigstore the other one you were talking about, Akira?
Yeah, so I actually just found it. So what it is Docker Hub enables independent software vendors via the Docker Verified Publisher Program. Mm-hmm. And what that does is the vendors in the program can distribute trusted Dockerized content through Docker Hub with images signed by the verified publisher. Mm-hmm. So,
okay, yeah. So that's for folks who are curious to know more about this. If you're working to publish container images, or you are publishing container images, then yeah, you want to go down that path. If you're looking to do a validation, and Mike, you haven't heard this rant for a while. If you're looking to do validation of your container images, you probably don't want to use the Docker signed images, because that's unless it's improved, and hopefully it has. It's really difficult. It's not really possible to fully validate the image path and your signature path. So you do want to look at something like Sigstore that's actually a little bit more modern and thought out than, unfortunately, what the Docker guys have. Maybe they've improved. If they have, my apologies. But anyways, since we're playing hot potato, Akira, where do you want to go next? What story catches your eye?
Ooh, okay. Let me see here. So this was an interesting one. This is actually from earlier this month, since we missed a couple of weeks. But this was something called PyPy, which is researchers at Phylum, I think it's Phylum or maybe it's Phylum, discovered over 24 Python packages on the PyPy registry that are pushing info-stealing malware. What they do is they actually inject the malicious scripts via the import statement, and that looks like a legitimate library. So the benefit that this attacker gains from copying existing legitimate packages is because the PyPy landing page for the package is generated from the setup.py and the README. So what it'll look like is actually looks like a real landing page with mostly working links and the whole bit there. So unless thoroughly inspected, a brief glance might lead one to believe that this is also a legitimate package. Something else that I got a huge kick out of is that in the malicious scripts, what they can do, or what they did, is they got a little sophisticated here. And I can screen share later. I'm not sure if that'll show up on the podcast or not. But they used white space. They just did a bunch of spaces or tabs or whatever, and they just hid it all on the right side of the screen, which I thought was incredible. It's just little weird stuff like that I'm getting a big kick out of right now. So that was a lot of fun.
Yes, the unexplored frontier here. 318 space characters. Which, I wonder, what made them come up with that particular 318 spaces? Were they looking at word wrapping or something like that, or screen size, or was this just a random choice where they figured that nobody would notice that it's just sitting over here off the right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was taking advantage of the screen size, which is just, I don't know, I thought that was kind of genius.
Yeah, so CISO's message for your AppSec team: invest in your budget in larger screens so they can catch these types of issues. Don't worry about SCA or other types of software supply chain solutions.
Get the best monitor. Get the best monitor you can get your AppSec people. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, exactly. How about let me pop run over back to Mike.
Sure. So I love protocols, as you might notice from that's one of the parts of the greeting that we have here on ASW. And HTTP 3, that's been Portswigger, aka James Kettle, has been looking at HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, which is really fun to have a new protocol, because HTTP 1 came out in 1991, stuck around for a decade and a half, and didn't get any updates. it still works and is perfectly fine. But what's fun about new protocols is that we have more modern security-minded analysis, design around them, but there's both the design and implementation that can fall apart, or not necessarily fall apart in terrible internet breaking ways, but in edge cases. And this is what James Kettle has been looking at with request smuggling, and here is with connection contamination. So this is highlighting less about a vulnerability class that's going to start plaguing everyone and is pervasive, but more about the approach to, what can you do with that switch now as organizations migrate from HTTP 1 or 2 to 3, having reverse proxies that are having column impedance mismatches, because I like my electrical engineering background, to say what's different that happens if you're trying to write and make assumptions from one protocol to another. So it's a great 5-minute video that he includes as well. So it's an easy read, easy view, and it's just a great reminder to look at protocols, because we'll probably see in Black Hat 2023 something about connection contamination, or I'm going to guess Portswigger is going to have something around HTTP 3 to show off during next year's summer camp. So that was sort of that call to action and kind of interesting research that I saw.
Yeah.
So, Mike, what's the big difference between HTTP 1 and 2 and 3?
So one of the coolest differences is that rather than you can multiplex essentially multiple requests within HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, as well as HTTP 3 has first class support for TLS, basically saying we want to encrypt our frames and we want to do so with a very narrow set of approved ciphers protocols, and we'll also introduce things like zero round trip resumption, which is another area which can be an edge case that can here be dragons if you misuse a bunch of the crypto tokens to restart connections, but it's essentially a performance differences, as well as HTTP 3 is layered on what at the time was quick, but is now UDP transport. So everybody can dust off their TCP and UDP jokes and no longer have to talk about three-way handshakes with HTTP 3. They can talk about frames and connections, and hoping that, for example, Burp Suite can do some good HTTP 3 manual inspection, since it's becoming a little bit less human readable friendly as it gets so complex. So I think that's another fun thing to look at in these protocols.
I think I don't want to. I don't want to downplay or poo-poo the work that these protocol bodies do, because it's they're doing generally a great job and super important, and we need to move towards the future, and that's all great. But when James comes along after a new protocol has been released like this and sort of figures out a few ways, it makes me think that, and I'm saying this for a reason, it makes me think you want to have some more technical people on, and I know they probably have technical people, so it sounds wrong. It makes me think maybe you want to have more security people. Maybe they're not there on these protocol things, and maybe they are there. So if so, ignore what I'm saying here. But the reason I'm saying it is for our listeners who are curious about learning and helping. A lot of these protocol boards, to use that phrase, I'm going to be loose with my language today. That's a first. But these groups they're usually volunteer based, of get together and work on a next protocol, either for NIST is doing it, Cloud Security Alliance is doing it, they're doing it over at W3C. So it can be, the meetings, I'm not going to lie, they can get old and painful and make you want to just kill someone across a phone line. But at the same time, if you want to sort of see how these things are done and actually help form the next version of these protocols, so that something like this takes more than a few months to come out, there's a great chance, and people would love to have your input.
They would, and there's also the minutes from those meetings can be interesting, just to see how do discussions go, how are standards put together. So they can be perhaps not exciting reading, but interesting reading on that case. And I think the one thing I'll temper here too is that this connection contamination is a little bit more focused on the implementation errors and those trying to mismatch HTTP 2 and 3. But to your point, there's still some great great analysis research that can go into HTTP3, many other protocols that are being developed. Everyone's talking, or many people are talking about end-to-end encryption. And so there's also an MLS standard, a message layer, standard service security. Sorry, we are a security podcast. That's the S.
And really quickly, please don't, listeners, don't think that I'm sort of trying to slag on the HTTP, easy for me to say, HTTP3 design board, or that's. I'm not trying to say that they screwed up in any way, shape, or form. That's not the point of what I'm saying. But there's always space for more people to help. How about that?
Yes, and there is, and I think also there's the dynamic that protocols, software are created by people and groups of people. And so understanding the dynamics of groups, how to affect change is a very important skill, especially one that would be helpful to develop within the security community, much like doing code review, perhaps.
Wow, look at that. Look at that. Segue. Wow, that's worthy of an award right there.
So, and I bring up code review because I wanted to hear John talk a little bit more about this article.
Yeah, sure. So I think I think in the next episode or two, Mike, we have to do a little bit of a think back about the topics we've had this year. But one of the ones that's been on, or at least probably out of my mouth a few times, is talking about code review and how do you do code reviews, how do you improve, and how do you focus them. And those last two seem to be something that Meta's been thinking about as well, the parent company to Facebook, and Metascapes or Metaverse, whatever they're calling it. But so this blog post talking about it's actually pretty neat. If you haven't seen it yet, I think you'll like it. That's talking about how do you improve a code review from a point of view of really not quite threat modeling it, but sort of walking through a model of looking at the life cycle of a code review process. They start off by talking like actually doing it on percentile, right? So like P25, no problem. The quick code reviews go through, like we were talking just last 2 weeks ago. But it's those P75 ones, the ones that are taking longer, which could take 2 or 3 days for that code review process alone. And that's where things get that's a space where you can improve, right? And make your code be more make your development lifecycle be more efficient. And then they go through sort of how do we go about this? What are we doing? Are we actually going to go through line by line? Are we going to think about what the process of this PR is, and how do we then, what are the potential issues which could come out of this, right? Which is completely different than what I was talking about 2 weeks ago, but it's actually quite useful. So if I see a code review around, we're doing a code review on MongoDB, someone has submitted a pull request around the indexer. Okay, well, the indexer is working with that encryption data as we were talking about last half hour. Could there be some sort of modification of either the access or modification of the encryption in there, right? So it's a little more focused for thinking about what you're doing than what are the actual lines of code. So it's a pretty good read, not very long, but it gives you sort of a different way to think about some of these things of how do you, it's a more mature way, right? But yeah, I thought that was a good read for folks.
So John is kind of like focusing on what are we actually trying to do here as opposed to like line by line by line.
Yeah.
And using like tools or approaches that are like more targeted for that.
I don't think you'd have to have tools for this, right? So this is, you could just really start off on a piece of paper as someone sent you a PR to review. But the idea is usually, and when you're out last time, glad you're back and feeling better. But when you're out, I think Mike asked me a question to talk a little more about how do I do a code review, or how do we go through that process? And what I was saying for it partially, lick a finger, stick it in the wind. Not really, but like for a more junior developer, I'm going to look more closely at the at sort of line by line what they're doing versus someone I have more confidence or faith in. I'm going to approach that code review in a different manner. But what they're saying here is whether either one of those, because that's probably not the best way to do it. Let's be honest, right? You should be looking at them all fairly similarly in a way. But what they're doing here is instead of slicing and dicing based off the maturity of the developer, they're saying think about the really threat model, the pull request, and go, okay, well, what could this affect, or how could it affect it? And then from that, with that in your head, then read the code. And I think either way, what's going to happen is the problem is if you come into a medium to large size PR and you're sort of blind, right? You might know the code base, you know what's going on, you know what he's working on, but suddenly you've got this diff in front of you. Okay, what am I looking at? And that's usually going to take was going to say 5-10 lines of code, but probably 5 to 10% of the PR, right? Just figure out what's going on here, what changed, and what's happening, and hopefully they didn't mix white space with code or with actual code changes, because that's like nails on a chalkboard. But yeah, instead of going that very generic approach, it's like take a moment, step back, and think about what was the intent here. And again, this can trip you up, because like if you see a PR and the subject on it is, we're going to modify the MongoDB indexer, and then suddenly you see code down in there somewhere that has something to do with cleaning up the database or something else, that's going to really sort of screw with your brain. And maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing depending on the PR, but it's at least allowing you to walk into that review with a little more intent.
I have personally never thought about threat modeling a PR. That's really cool.
And I think some of the things that could benefit from threat modeling PRs are WordPress, for example, and more so perhaps the WordPress plugins. You had an example of an article of more injection attacks against plugins, and John had another article that was also about Vuln in Spotify's backstage system. I want to just pull those in together along with, since we're slow on time now, the Thinkst Quarterly, which is a collection of presentations on vulns, like those two articles that you brought in, Akira and John, as well as broad areas like cryptography, clever cryptography for that matter. For those of you who are interested in our discussion with Ken, as well as want to dive into some presentations over this past year that have been really cool on cryptography subjects. And then there was also some nifty sundries that appealed to me. One was another protocol related to Apple's private relay. So I wanted to highlight a couple of those because Thinkst puts a lot of effort into looking through several dozen conferences and several hundred presentations before they whittle away to this shorter list that they highlight. So I'm not sure, John or Akira, if you've had a chance to look over this list, or there was a particular title that jumped out to you. But either one of the vulns you were highlighting or one of these areas might be of interest.
I'll come back to Akira's previous on the Docker container images on page 26, I think. Yeah. There's an article or a talk talking about hiding malware in Docker Desktop's secret virtual machine, which sounds sort of interesting. This is one of my favorite reports that comes out. I can't believe it's quarterly. Imagine if they only did this once a year; it'd be sort of mind blowing. But yeah, there's all sorts of good stuff in here. I just about 10 minutes ago realized that a 4-hour meeting for me this afternoon was canceled, so I think I'm going to be looking at this a little bit closer.
Awesome. Well, there's another thing you can also look at a little bit closer is a article from NCC Group, and highlighted this for two reasons. One is from Jennifer Furnick, whose team and their research we've covered on the show several times. We've pulled in a lot of blog posts from NCC Group. So just wanted to highlight some research we often use as sources. So there's a great list here too. So if you have a second 4-hour meeting canceled there, John, there's a part 2 of this article has a long list of other research you could look into. But part 1 is pretty cool because it's about leading a security research team, which possibly also could generalize to just leading a deep technical team that I thought was really neat. And this possibly also, Akira, maybe looks like things that are like, if you're out, hunting for a job or starting, working with engineers, looking at a list of, well, what's the culture of this engineering group that I would want to go into? And hopefully some of these would actually appeal to you.
Yeah, I think if I've learned anything from working in tech, or honestly my working life, it's that the culture matters a lot more than even necessarily like the technology. I mean, the tech matters, of course, the engineering standards really matter, but if you can't work together, then forget it. And that's a big thing that's often facing AppSec teams and engineering teams as well, is like just that aspect of working together and not having a lot of antagonism between the two. So I don't know if any of our listeners are looking to like start their first job, or maybe are in the beginning of their career, such as I am, I think the best thing to do, is just to find that culture fit, find the people you vibe with, as the kids say these days, and just not exploit it, but really mine that. That's actually something that I really like about doing this podcast, if anything, is because I enjoy you guys as my co-hosts and I learn a lot. So you got to go for the learning as opposed to necessarily the money or the prestige.
Yeah, and I think a message here too is that, especially saying culture fit isn't so much about are you as much into synthwave or Dungeons and Dragons as I am, but more of how is the team handling building the research? How are they, there's a point here in the article, bold attempts should be rewarded. I'm basically focused on what is the work, how do we do the work, rather than individuals are important, but the culture of what the engineering looks like, how people are treated, I think is the important thing to emphasize there. And John, we're running out of time here, so we're going to have to turn it over to you to take us out for some final thoughts on this, or if you want to squeeze in one last article.
Mike, it's okay. We all make mistakes. And that was a joke. Sorry. So 2 things on this. I want to actually focus on this for a second. And first, I think Akira made a really interesting statement from the point of view of when I go looking for a job with a little more seniority, I'm looking to see if I can change and improve the culture in a team.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't, right? But that's sort of an interesting thing to think about from as an engineering leader. One of the things I'm looking to do is, can I set and improve a culture? Is there a problem site-wide in the company? And that's even harder to figure out when you join, right? And then also I can't really tell the team that it's not me, it's someone else. So it's a bit of a juggle. But what caught my eye in here, not just being at the top of the article, is confidence is a skill. And going back to talking about diversity and things like that too, it's one thing as the white male, even with blue hair, to be confident about what I'm doing, but how can I help improve and boost the confidence in others around me is something that's always important. Yeah, she was awesome. She will be missed in this particular format. I know she's still around. But let's see if we have time for one more, if I can squeak in here. I'm going to go back to the Spotify thing. We talked about them really briefly, or you did. And there was 2 articles in here. One is Spotify has an open source vulnerability management platform. And vuln management has become one of those sort of neat things over the last year or two, not so much from a scanner point of view or that, but just, oh my God, how do I keep track of all the vulnerabilities in my organization? So if you're in that point of view, and there's, the vendors are beating down your door and you want to maybe look at an open source version, Spotify's got something for you called, oh, come on, John, it's on my page and I still can't see it. Kitsune, right? Yeah, why don't they have that in the title? And then the second is Kitsune has a interface with Backstage, which is another open source project from Spotify. Spotify, thank you for your open source contributions. But this thing called Backstage has an RCE. So Backstage is it's not quite a portal, but it's a interface that you'd set up in your company to allow developers to easily access and spin up systems as necessary to do things, and actually also access internal other libraries and packages which your company has designed. The RCE has a CVSS of 9.8, which means very bad on the John Kinsella t-shirt scale. So yeah, with that, happy patching, and we'll see everybody in a week.
Indeed. Happy patching. We'll see everybody in a week. That might have to be one of kind of our catchphrases. I'll thank Kira. Thank you, John, for joining us about sending out a list of things that we got to go patch now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of Spotify and artists, check out some synthwave artists like Bunny X on Bandcamp. Support your artists, support music, because we want to hear more music. And with that, PSA, we'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.